Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker. He's called David Hogue. David Hogue is an applied psychologist and UX designer. He's been a UX designer lead at Google since 2013. David has been studying user behavior and designing interfaces since 1997, way before it was cool, apparently. Little extra fact about David, he enjoys landscaping and gardening design and pruning trees. I was actually in the pub last night with David, and he was having a conversation next to me, and he was very clever. It was just all going over my head, so I'm looking forward to this. Welcome to the stage, David Hogue.
All right, good morning, everyone. Lauren had such beautiful, full-screen, wide slides, and I am just going to show you everything 3 times. So, good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. And as Mr. Bingo said, I'm Dave Hogue. Just some quick contact info, and then I'll put this up again at the end if any of you would like to reach out and find me. Okay, come on, clicker, let's go. All right, so we're going to be talking about simplicity today, and we're talking about it because it's actually remarkably easy to make anything complicated. And so we don't really think about putting effort into this. This is Rube Goldberg. How many people know him and his illustrations? Yeah, so Rube Goldberg is the guy that did things like this. How to open a bottle of beer if you have no bottle opener. Right? So lots and lots of unnecessary steps in order to accomplish a relatively simple task. So we don't plan to make things complicated. It just sort of happens. Even when we are looking, it sort of happens. We do, however, have to work to simplify. When we notice the complication, we realize it, and then we've got to do something about it. So we're going to be talking today about how things become complicated and what we can do about it. And let's start off by talking about products as systems. Now, you might be thinking, what? Why are we going to be talking about this? Because we really have to be thinking about the inner workings of things to understand how we've made them complicated and messy. Now, systems have variables and rules, and we talk about them in terms of rate of change and the state or the condition at a moment in time and the interactivity or the behavior of that system. And we can describe it on essentially what are just 4 different variables. We can talk about how many variables are there. Are we talking about systems that have just a few variables or systems that have a lot of variables? Oops, don't want to spoil it. We have what are the types of system rules? Is this a linear system or is this a non-linear system? We can talk about whether or not we are able to predict the future state of the behavior of the system. Are they deterministic or non-deterministic? And we can talk about whether or not the system actually can adapt and change to changing conditions around it. So is it adaptive or non-adaptive? This is not usually a language we talk about in design and product design very often, so humor me here. You'll see how it all starts to make sense. Now, systems, there are different levels of complexity in systems. They can start off with the really simple ones. These are the ones that we like because we understand them. It's a small number of variables, it's simple rules, we understand exactly what's going on. Complicated things are the things we often end up making and then try to turn them into simple systems. They tend to have lots and lots of variables, but they still tend to have fairly simple rules. Now we've got this next group. These are complex systems. They may have many variables, but they're dynamic. They tend to change over time. And so they're not these really simple, predictable systems. They're modifying themselves. And then the last class, and we'll also talk about this, are the chaotic systems. These are the ones that have the really strange behavior. They have a small number of variables, but they're almost completely unpredictable for us. And it seems like it should be a predictable thing. Now, we could also visualize these and think about simple to chaotic systems in terms of how they might look, right? Like the simple system, there's not much to it. I know where I am, I know where I want to go, there's one path, done. But as the systems become complicated and complex and chaotic, these illustrations sort of capture what it feels like to be working with them. Now today we're actually going to be focusing just on the center two. We're going to be talking about the complicated systems, which is something that we can do something about. And we're going to be talking about the complex systems, which we may be able to simplify in some cases. So, focusing on these two, we might be able to redefine them. And if we're talking about products as systems, we can say, well, instead of this technical definition of how many variables and what are the rule types, I like to think of them this way. A complicated system is a product that has many, many parts. It's got lots of moving pieces. Whereas a complex system is like a system of systems. It's a product of many products. And so you can see where the complexity begins to come from. All right, now, what about the chaotic systems? We said they're simple ones. We're not going to do anything about those. We're going to focus on complicated and complex. But the chaotic ones, why don't we bother talking about these? So we can describe chaotic systems as, they seem like they're impossibly complex because their behavior is unpredictable, but it actually turns out that mathematically, there's almost always a remarkably few number of actual variables involved. And so there's this paradox of, it looks like it should be simple, but I can't quite figure it out. Now, the first real chaotic system that we began to study, and this was only 50, 60 years ago, was the weather. So you know when you look at the weather forecast, you can see that it's just 7 to 10 days out. And then beyond that, it's pretty much just a, I don't know, guess, right? Air, temperature, water, something will happen. Why can't we predict the weather so far out? We've got satellites, we've got weather stations all over the place. We have more data than we know what to do with. We have supercomputers that are trying to do this, and yet we still have no better accuracy beyond about 10 days. So in the past 60 years, we have gone from 3 to 5 to 10 days of predictability. Seems like we should be doing better. Well, that's because weather is actually a chaotic system. Those three equations, those three simple differential equations, describe atmospheric convection. And that little graphic beside them is what's called a strange attractor. What that strange attractor tells us is that I know that the weather is going to be within some limits. They're called the bounds of the system. It's never going to be 500 degrees outside, and we're never going to get 30 meters of rain in a day. That's just not going to happen, right? But we never know where the weather is going to be within those boundaries. Somewhere in that graph is tomorrow's weather, and we just don't know exactly where it is. And these laws are universal. They apply all over the place. This is the South Pole of Jupiter. We sent a spacecraft out to fly by and take these photos, and you see the same patterns in the clouds of a gas giant as you do in the clouds of the Earth. So these laws apply everywhere. Right? Now, we can't simplify chaos. That's why we're not going to pay attention to it. Okay? We can't make chaotic systems predictable. When we have a truly chaotic system that we're working with, we just have to live with it. So we recognize it. We're like, yeah, mathematically, this is awesome. But from a design perspective, not much we can do. All right, so we're going to focus on what we can work on, complicated and complex systems. And sometimes the complex systems are naturally complex. It's just the way they are. My favorite traffic circle in the world, right? It works. There might be other solutions to it, right? But it is certainly a complex experience. Now, I call this one complex because it is essentially a system of systems. If you were to break it down and think about it, there is a roadway system, there is a car, which is a system, and there are pedestrians, which each individual person is a system. And the people interact with one another, who interact with the cars, who interact with the physical structure of the roadway. So it's a system of systems that exhibits very complex behavior. Now, to draw a quick analogy for you, it's like people on the internet. People interacting with one another have mobile devices, which is another system, who interact with web-based services and applications, which is another system. So when we talk about user experience design, we're talking about systems and systems and systems. So many of these are naturally complex, right? So we narrow ourselves a bit more, and we say, well, if they're naturally complex, there might be something we can do with it. But the complicated ones, these are things that we made bad. And these are the things that we can simplify. Right? Now, I like pruning trees. Yes, I like the aesthetics of the structure of the tree. I also have another hobby, and that is as I travel around the world, I take photographs of the payment kiosks in parking garages. These kiosks are uniformly terrible experiences all around the world, right? I have become trapped in parking garages because I can't figure out how to pay to get out. And oftentimes you can't find another human to actually help you. You know you have a problem with your design if total strangers write instructions for other total strangers and tape them onto the machines, right? So, this is something that doesn't need to be complicated. It is something which was made complicated. And so this is just a fantastic example of opportunities to simplify. So how did those parking garage kiosks, how did some of the products you use on a daily basis actually become complicated? Well, if we take a step back at our own design process, this is what we often see. In the beginning, we have a project, and we're like, I got this. I understand it. I know how hard this is going to be. I know what we need to achieve. We know what we're going to do to get there. We even provide estimates of time and effort and cost to clients to say, I'll give you a finished product in N days for this number of dollars. And then we start, right? And not shortly after we start, someone in the group or from the client says, oh, by the way, there are these other requirements, or there are some other constraints, or there's a couple things we forgot to talk about and some information that you didn't have. And the complication of the product begins to creep upward. Shortly after that, someone during one of the ideation sessions and sketching on a whiteboard says, dude, it would be so cool if, right? And another feature goes on the list. And so now there's more to do in the same time and with the same budget. And then we actually start prototyping and testing things, and the client sees it and the creative director sees it, and they go, this is very nice, it looks good. But I think it should, and it needs a little more, and there's still this other thing we haven't done, right? And so we get a little more creep and a little more change. And then we start building it, and somewhere an engineer says, this is a really nice idea, but you know the system doesn't support it. Or this is a really nice idea, but it's actually difficult to implement. How important is it? Can we get rid of it? Right? And you're like, no, that's like the whole purpose of the thing. And so then they figure out how to work around what the constraints are. And eventually, sometime a few weeks after the original deadline, we end up at a point where we call feature complete. And we're like, oh, thank God, it's done. Get it out the door, launch it, let's keep going, right? But there's a problem here, and that is that we have designed and iterated ourselves to the point of maximum complication. Yes, it does all of the things on the checklist, and it may do some of them well, and it may do some of them poorly, but the overall experience is one that just feels complicated. It's not as simple as that concept we had on day one. So what are we going to do at this point in time, right? How did we get there? Well, we just talked about some of the things that happened, but if we really break it down, we start to talk about things like, well, maybe we rushed some of the design. Or maybe product management wasn't really tracking the scope and the cost and the number of requests and change orders that were being tracked. Maybe there were technical issues and the system can't support that, or we couldn't build it in the way that we thought we were going to. And maybe there were simply constraints and requirements. You can't do this because there's GDPR. You can't do this because there is a technical constraint. You can't do this because we actually don't have that piece of data, and so we can't make that prediction for you. Right? And all of these things surface. And then we have to figure out how to work around them. And every time you work around something, you make complication happen. Right? It happens gradually. But eventually we get to a point where the light bulb goes off and everyone on the team goes, ugh, that's not very good. Right? And so they all look at each other and they say the same thing. Let's make it simpler. Let's get rid of all this mess. Let's fix this. Right? Now, we'll pause for a moment and we'll say, not everything should be simple. Right? I'm not really confident that we should have a simple one-click nuclear launch mechanism. Right? There's a reason why it takes multiple people and codes and keys and simultaneous timing, because this is the kind of thing you don't want to do accidentally, right? Nodding off at work. So too much simplicity can sometimes be bad. Sometimes we take it too far. That's just a little story. Do you recognize these? Do you know what these are? Yeah, these are from Amazon. These are the one-click buttons from Amazon, so that when you're sitting on the toilet and you have no toilet paper, click, and Amazon sends you toilet paper, right? Or when you're taking out the trash and you have no trash bags, click, Amazon sends you trash bags. It's a really nice idea for like the daily staples. It makes it really, really simple. But when might simplicity not be one of our goals? When might we want people to take time to interact and understand something? If it's too fast and too easy, some types of problems can occur. We maybe make mistakes. I didn't quite know what was going on, but it was just so easy to click forward, and then all of a sudden I own 300 pounds of dog food. Right? Some inadvertent interactions may be irreversible. What do you mean I can't return 300 pounds of dog food? People may not adequately understand the actions of their actions and the outcomes, but I don't have a dog. Oops. People may not learn how to use the system. This is easy. I don't need to put any thought into it. I don't actually have to think about what I'm doing. Click, 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 done. Right? Products may be easy to misuse or subvert or mislead, so there's the evil intention that may happen. Products may have unintended consequences, right? Something might happen in the future based on interactions that are too easy to perform. Sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? I mean, come on, click, beer me. But what if you're an unsupervised 10-year-old? Or what if you're a recovering alcoholic? What are the unintended consequences of having a one-click beer delivery button, right? So have we made it too simple in some situations? So some difficulty, some complexity, sometimes slowing people down can be a good thing. The financial services industry is highly regulated, and one of the things in those regulations is essentially slowing people down, giving them lots and lots of information so that they can make a reasoned decision about where they can invest their money or where they should invest their money. And so, would you really want one-click stock purchasing and then to have someone maliciously promote a whole bunch of terrible stocks to you? This sounds great, buy. Another great one, buy, and how much money might you lose? So they put these little friction moments into the experience to say, here's the data, here's what's going on, here's what to consider. They make the buying process multiple steps so that you understand exactly how much money you're going to spend and that it is, in effect, an irreversible action. And then at the very end, they show you all of the choices you've made and ask you once more, are you really sure? Yes, right? So it takes probably 12 steps more than theoretically it could to buy something because you have to slow down to think about what you are purchasing. So the goals for simplicity have to be balanced against what are some of the things that might go wrong. How much friction is ideal, how much ease is ideal. And we can really probably identify three goals for ourselves about simplicity. We can talk about what can we reduce, right? How do I make it easier? How do I get rid of waste? How do I reduce errors? How do I reduce stress? We can talk about improving the experience, enhancements to meaningfulness and the quality of the product. We can even talk about individual well-being. I feel good about this. And we can talk about helping people. How do they learn? How do they share? How do they make better decisions? So if we think about balancing the ease and the friction, we might use these principles or these goals to guide us. In the end, what we want is something that helps people feel effective, intelligent, and confident, right? I can do this, I understand this, and I am sure that this is what I want to do. So I'm not sure if Einstein actually said this or not, but it's widely attributed to him. Make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? It's the caution. Don't go too far. Don't take too much away. Don't make it too slippery. Maybe some friction helps. Now, if you recognize what this figure is, stay quiet. How many of you don't recognize this figure? Anyone in the room not recognize this figure? No? One? Okay, just one. Boy, you're brave. One hand. All right. That's Damien Hirst's dot image of Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse. It's a graphic, literally a graphic illustration of simplification, right? The problem with this level of simplification, for an artist, this seems like a brilliant thing. But if you're doing something in terms of product design, the problem behind this is if you don't already know who Mickey Mouse is, you would have no idea what Hirst's painting portrayed. That simplification requires so much prior knowledge and experience. And if you have a product that is new to the world and going out there for the first time, no one has that prior knowledge and that prior experience. And if you oversimplify, people may have no idea what it is, how to use it, or what to do. So even though we're talking about simplification, we caution you about not oversimplifying. So we follow the law of parsimony, sometimes also called Occam's razor. All things being equal, the simpler solution is the better solution. All right, so we find ourselves at the peak of this complication curve. We've worked ourselves up to maximum complication. What do we do from here? What are some of our options? We need to get this number, this score, this level down. There's a few methods that we can apply. But the amount of effort that we put into it really determines how much we're able to simplify. If we pretty much do nothing and we just polish up the edges and ship the product as is, we can get rid of a little of that complication, but we're still going to send out a complicated product. It just might be a slightly prettier complicated product. But if we put a little bit more time and energy into iteration, a sufficiently motivated person, on the other hand, is going to tolerate an inordinate amount of poop icon. What this means is that if you are the only product in a space and people need your service, they will use it even if it's crappy. Most of us, however, are not in that situation. We don't have a lone product in the space. There is competition, and so we need to make the product better. If I really, really, really have to get something done, I will tolerate really, really bad experiences. How many of you have done that on the web? You've hated every step you took through the entire process, and you finished it despite that product. Yes, almost every single hand goes up, right? Because you felt you had no choice. That's a protected, privileged position for a product. That's not what we can take advantage of. So we want to put more effort into our simplification, right? We want to work a little bit harder to make this product better. So if we put just a little more time and effort into it, we can do things like polish up the content and polish up the visual design, maybe smooth out some of the motion and the interactivity and refine a gestural interaction system so we can make the product more clear for people. It's amazing what a professional rewrite can do to simplify a product, even if you change nothing about the architecture and the interactions. But if we keep working a little bit more and we start thinking about those interactions and we think about the architecture of the product, now we can start to rearrange things to make them a little bit easier to understand and act upon. Maybe we take a few steps out of the checkout process. So instead of buying scented candles in 7 steps, now I can buy my favorite scented candles in 3 steps, and it feels faster. Right? So that's just a structural change. But if we really put more time and effort into it, we can reach sort of our maximum simplification. And that is, we have the opportunity to really start looking critically at how people move through your product and service. And sometimes not even just your product, but what are they doing before, during, and after an experience with your product. This usually requires much larger changes to the product. This requires us sometimes to change our principles and to change the architecture and sometimes even change the core functionality. But if we make it easier for people to flow through an experience, that really is what people say, makes people say, wow, this was easy, this was simple, this was pleasant or delightful. Unfortunately, most teams don't spend the extra time to get much farther beyond the as-is state. But we do have some techniques that we can apply. However, the client usually has this response. When you say, feature complete, we're finished, but we still need to go back through and iterate and make this better even though everything is working now. And the client goes, wait, what? You said it's all working, why aren't we launching this? Right? Do we really need to keep designing something after we've finished designing it? Yes. And why? Because this is where the simplification happens. Not on the way up, but on the way down. Now, you know the phrase, you can't see the forest for the trees? Simplification and product simplification is one of those things where we think to ourselves, am I looking at a forest or am I seeing the individual trees? And what should I be focused on? We become so close to our products over the process of design that we become blind to the complication we have actually put into that product ourselves. It makes sense to us because we created it. It's other people who are going to use it. And so we can't just easily step back and look at our own product objectively. So we have to remind ourselves to do that. We have to apply some techniques to do that. And we have to do some research and testing to figure out what's working and what isn't. So what are some signs, if we're blind to the complication we put into our own products, what might we look for that would be an indicator that maybe we've added some complication in this process, right? Well, did you design something because you needed it? Or did you design something because there's a well-documented user need for it? So designing for yourself is often a really good way to make something complicated for other people. Did you lead with technology? Did someone in your company say, look at this really cool thing we can do, let's put it into our product? And did you ask the question, do people need us to do that? Or did you go, wow, that's so cool, no one else does this, let's add it? Right? Well, maybe you're a solution looking for a problem. Did you map the product structure to your organizational structure? Right? Now, I have to happily say, this one seems to be decreasing in frequency in my experience. 10 years ago or so, I was working in financial services, and it was super common for banks and investment houses to actually take their internal organizational structure and map it directly to their website. This is the investment group, this is the banking group, this is the research group, this is the retirement group. That's fine if you are your own user and client, but the end consumer does not think about managing their money in terms of your organizational structure. So if your product is mapped to your company structure, chances are it is not mapped to what the end user actually has to do. Product by consensus, where you do everything in the product only after everyone on the team goes, yes. Right? And so then you end up being nice to one another, and you end up adding things that don't have to be there, and you end up agreeing to compromises that might actually be bad. Maybe you've made assumptions. And the problem with assumptions at the beginning of a project is that if you don't test them or think critically about them, they have this curious way of becoming fact over the course of the project. That the assumption on day one is just something at the end of the project that everyone knows to be true, even though no one ever actually checked that fact, right? So when you make assumptions and then you don't test them, you've probably made something complicated. Maybe you copy other solutions, right? I think that's what happened with parking garage kiosks. There's like half a dozen companies that make them, but they're all sort of bad in the same way. And it's like, really? Is there like some industrial spy who is making money by propagating bad ideas from company to company? In design, we call these anti-patterns, right? Now, we know what a pattern is, right? A pattern is a known solution to a known problem. An anti-pattern is when you take that known solution, but you apply it to the wrong problem. So you use a perfectly good design pattern in the wrong situation or the wrong circumstance. And although it looks on the surface like it's a good idea, it actually isn't. And it adds complication. Indirect action, one of my favorites. Anytime you ask a person to do something here in order to get an outcome or an interaction there, you've introduced complication. Because now the human has to do work here, then do something here, and they have to remember what happened here to then go do something here. And so if you bring these things together, if you treat humans as if they are magnetic, and you always take to them the information and the functionality that they need at that moment, it's going to be a far simpler experience. If we say things like, make it a setting, make it a choice, let the user decide, right? That's essentially abdicating your responsibility as a designer to create a good product. You are not willing to make a product decision, and so the answer is, I don't know, let the person do it. And so you then have lists and lists of things that people have to choose from. And the more people have to choose and change the settings and make decisions, the harder it is, the less enjoyable it is, and the more complicated it is, right? So if you say, let the user decide, that's a trigger word. If you hear feedback from people, messy, confusing, I mean, how could you not miss this one, right? If your user in research says, this is complicated, they've just told you you have a problem, right? This is the most obvious thing to listen for. The trick here is you actually have to do the research. You actually have to put it in front of people and get them to provide you this feedback. What if the team is saying, it would be nice to have, right? We said that as one of the things on the ramp up to the feature complete state. So anytime you say it would be nice to have, probably means you've thought of something that wasn't originally a requirement and has not been validated as an actual user need. You just think there's something clever or cute or shiny about it, right? And so it gets added to the list. If you try to be everything to everyone, you end up being nothing to everyone, right? For those of you Simpsons fans, this is the Homer mobile, and I don't know if you remember this episode or not. Yes, Homer's long-lost brother, who happens to be a very successful automotive maker, finds him, hires him to make the car for the everyman, which is an abomination in the automotive world, and it costs $85,000. So it's not even affordable to everyone, right? So it's nothing to everyone. And then my favorite, very end here, I was just packing for a weekend trip, right? So if you say, let's put it in just in case, you've probably added things that don't need to be there, right? Just in case means you don't really know what situations or circumstances may arise. All right, so we've got all these signals. These are things we can look for. These are things we can listen for. So what do we do about this unnecessary complication? Please give us methods. So there are some foundational design methods that we can apply. I'm not going to go into great detail on any of these because they should all be familiar to any designer, any UX designer in here. Your methodology, right, is identify, define, and frame. Be really, really clear about what you're trying to solve and keep yourself scoped to those problems. Use user-centered design methods, mental models and flows and maps and diagrams. Don't go straight to wireframes or mocks, right? That's not where you solve the problem. Start thinking a little bit sooner. Apply critical thinking skills. This is probably one of the most important things for a UX designer, is to have really strong critical thinking skills. And then, of course, the standard, iterate the hell out of it, right? You don't get it right the first time around. We keep working on it to improve it. Now, I like to talk about the iterative approach in a little bit more detail, because when we're working on product design, there's essentially 3 levels, 3 core iterations we go through. The first is when we talk about the structure of the product itself. What are all of the parts? What's the content, the functionality, the services? How are they interrelated? How is the structure of this thing going to meet a known and documented list of user needs? When we understand all the pieces that we need, now we start to think about how are they connected and how are people going to use them in sequence? How are they going to move through this product or service? And only once we know what the bits are and how they are connected and how people are going to move through them, do we shift our attention to creating an interface. Because now we know exactly what needs to happen in every step and what needs to be shown on every page and what information needs to be presented in which format. We've already thought about the foundation of the problems. Now we're just putting the interface on top of it. And through all of this, the decisions that we make at an earlier phase influence the decisions we make at a subsequent phase. So as I'm thinking about the structure, that is going to influence the flow. And as I think about the flow, it's going to influence the interface, and even some of the structural decisions are going to have an influence on the interface. But we've got to test all of these things, so we conduct research that runs through the entire thing. Do we have the right parts? Do we have the right connections? Do we have the right display mechanism? And we very often learn things that cause us to go back and make changes at one of these earlier levels. So it's not just the UX diagram of one big circle, right? Where you ideate and then you design and you prototype and you build and you launch and you measure and then you ideate. That big circle is nice because it tells you sort of what's happening at the product level. But our design process is actually iterations within iterations within iterations. It's almost like a complex system. It's a system of systems, right? All these connected parts. So here are some methods that we can use to simplify. Now, these actually come out of, you don't need to be embarrassed by your answers here. How many people have an Android phone? Okay. Oh, a nice number. Thank you. Okay. I'm on the Android team. So how many of you have the Android Pi, Android P, and the Pixel 3? Okay, some of you, which means you don't have Pixel phones if you don't have Android Pi, so you're waiting for your manufacturer or carrier to slowly, glacially roll it out to you. Sorry about that. For Android Pi, we had a simplicity goal. Let's make the user experience simpler for using a Pixel phone. And so we had these mechanisms that we set up for ourselves. Now, subtract is the first method for simplification that almost every single team goes to. We often just equate and, unfortunately, conflate simplification with subtraction. Get rid of all the excess stuff, right? That's just one mechanism, right? Get rid of all the superfluous, fine. But there's other things we can do. We can consolidate. Sometimes we have too many little pieces, and those little pieces could actually be combined into one thing instead. And so instead of having 17 things, maybe we've only got 8. We just reduce the number by consolidating. We're actually not losing any content or functionality. We're just combining stuff. Maybe we redistribute. Maybe it's complex and complicated simply because we've got things in the wrong place. Maybe we need to take something which is big and confusing and break it down into smaller pieces, each of which is more meaningful. Maybe we just haven't set the proper priorities. When you look at the screen and there's 12 options and you don't know which is the one most relevant and important because everything you can do has equal visual weight. So we just introduce some mechanism of prioritizing. Or maybe we don't need to show everything. Maybe we can conceal a few things. Sometimes it's just a matter of clarifying. And this is the paradoxical one in many cases, because to clarify often means we have to add something. Sometimes simplification happens with addition, not with subtraction. And one of the best examples is that icons alone always perform more poorly than icons with labels. I have yet to see a study in which labels do not help the functionality of an icon. And yet we seem to be obsessed with crafting clever little icons that have absolutely no explanation and an abstract representation of something really important for people to do. Wait, why? Why have we made this complicated, right? We did it because we like pretty, shiny. So here are some examples from Android. We'll quickly run through these. Over the past several years, the navigation bar, those 3 little icons at the bottom, have changed, right? We first focused on simplifying the visual representation, and then we began to consolidate functionality. So in this particular example here, we have a tap and a long press represented in that graphic. And then in the most recent version, this is all you get, that little pill down at the bottom, as gestural navigation was introduced. So things have been prioritized. We've also moved the search bar to the bottom. So rather than having interactive areas at the top and at the bottom, now all the core interactivity is at the bottom of the screen. Not only is it within thumb reach on taller screens, but it really doesn't make sense to have 2 interaction zones on the phone. We changed the setup journey, so when you get a brand new phone for the first time and it asks you some information, this journey actually just has a few core actions that need to happen, but it looked like this at the bottom. And for some of the phone manufacturers who inserted their own steps into the setup process, you might actually go through 15 steps before you can actually use your phone. So we started to say, do you really have to do all of it at the beginning? Can we maybe delay some of this? Can we consolidate some of these steps? Can we do it in a different way? And so the simplified experience is basically down to the 3 essential things that are necessary to get your phone working. And then we say, do you want to finish the configuration now, or would you like to do it later? And if someone says, I want to use my phone now, I'll do the rest later, sometime in the next 7 days, we send them a little reminder. Hey, there's still a few things you need to do to keep your phone, or to get your phone set up and keep it running. Would you like to do it now? And when they say yes, we just drop them into the remainder of the process, right? So they can use their phone much more quickly. These are the volume controls. This was the old version where when you opened up the volume controls, no matter what you were doing, you probably saw ring and then all of the others, and then you had to figure out, how do I actually change the volume on my music or my alarm? So we moved it, and now the volume controls actually show up on the screen right next to where the little volume rocker is on the side of the phone. So we changed the location proximity-wise, but we also became smart about how the phone was making sound at that moment. And so that would be the volume control that you get when you use the rocker. Quick settings was changed. I'll show you, this is what it looks like visually, so it's much more clear that these are tap zones, but the flow underneath was radically changed. Each one of those areas had 2 tap zones. The icon and the label were different, and no one really got that or understood that. So now there's just 1 tap zone, but there's a short tap and a long tap instead. And there's 1 fewer connections in there as well. Notifications, people, the number 1 complaint on any smartphone is the number of notifications. I'm being bothered by my phone. And so people often don't know, how do I stop these notifications? So now when you get a notification and you dismiss it, the phone says, do you not like this notification? You can turn it off, and you can do it right there in the notification bar instead of going to settings. And we've just recently introduced the digital well-being, because people complain about being interrupted by their phone and distracted by their phone and spending too much time on their phone and being obsessed by their phone and being worried about their phone. And so they're like, well, how long am I using my phone every day, and what am I doing on it, and where might I cut back? So we gather all of that data and we show it in a simple graph, and then you can dive in and you can say, how many times has this app notified me? How many times have I turned on my phone? And we make it very clear what's happening. And even watches, the watch changed. For the 3 core functions, when the watch turns on, it's your clock. If you swipe from the right, it's your fitness. And if you swipe from the left, it's your calendar and messages and notifications and any assistant things. All right. So as we wrap up talking about now, we've got these examples of simplicity. The law of complexity, the law of conservation of complexity, tells us that over time, complexity simply moves. This is how we've watched movies over the past, 70 years. Started with film and projectors, worked our way up through Betamax and VCRs and DVDs and set-top Rokus and little dongles that plug into the back of your television, right? So it seems like it should be a lot easier to watch a movie today. Except now watching a movie today requires your use of 3 devices: a television, a dongle, and a mobile app, right? So the individual device is simpler, but the overall experience has become complicated because complexity moves as we address it. Sometimes we need to use multiple methods in multiple places, right? Experiences can paradoxically feel simpler if you reduce the cognitive load and the friction, if you reduce ambiguity, if you help people feel more confident in what they're doing, even if it actually takes more steps, more time, and has more content, right? That's the balance that we talked about earlier. Meaningful focus, airport signage, right? Meaningful focus. People feel like they're doing something effectively if they're making progress. So as long as I see the next sign, I know where I'm going. Right? Value versus pain. The value of the outcome has to be greater than the cost of the time and effort. I'm not going to do it if it's going to take too much time and too much effort. Right? And we can turn this into an equation. The probability of interaction is equal to the value of the outcome divided by the effort put into achieving that outcome, multiplied by my confidence that this interaction is going to get me what I need. So you can just think about calculating those 3 things. What's the value, how much work, and am I confident it's going to do what I need? This is an example of sharing icons from 2012. I want to share this picture. Guess. right? Because you saw all these different icons, you had no idea what to tap on. Also, a great example of unlabeled arbitrary illustrations. I'm not entirely sure why a gift is share for Microsoft. All right, and a caution again, simple metrics may not tell the whole story. Counting interactions is not a measure of intent or purpose. Look how many times they clicked on things, because I have no idea what I'm doing, right? The duration of the interaction is not a measure of engagement. Look how much time they spent on our website, because I'm completely confused and can't figure out how to use it. Or the task completion rate is not always equivalent of easy and enjoyable. Look how many people completed their task. Yeah, and I hated every second of it, right? So just these measurements are insufficient. So the reminder, feature complete is not experience optimized. And when you find yourself at the top of this curve, remember that you have a set of choices. Simplification isn't easy. It is possible. There are things we can look out for. There are methods that we can apply. And we get to choose how far down this side we're going to come. All right? All right, so thank you. I know I went over time. Sorry about that. They're up here. They've been flashing 0 at me for like 10 minutes. Thank you. I'll be around for the rest of the time.